For those of you new to CISLL, just a quick reminder, this is the leadership team of CISLL. So we have two co-directors and then 3 special interest groups, and each special interest group has its own deputy director. So we are so thrilled to be here. I'd like to thank Lindsay Harris for co-directing with me, Julia Ogg, Mandy
Coretta Stutenberg,
and Melissa Klukas-Walter. And we're thrilled to have Megan as our GA this year. So, and then Nicole Giardelli helps us out as well. So thanks to everyone. These are sort of the 3 special interest groups that CISLL has. So please let us know which area you're most interested in, and we'll try to do some programming around the areas that you are interested in. We do have 2 awards that we offer at the end of the year. We have a CISLL Outstanding Faculty Award and a CISLL Outstanding Student Award. So please go to our website and see if you either know someone who meets this criteria who you would like to nominate, or if you would like to self-nominate. There's no shame in that. But we would be thrilled to acknowledge all the awesome scholarship that you do. We also have a Husky Commons repository, so if you want to submit your work, please do so, and then we can help get that out there. As a reminder, too, CISLL also offers a lot of resources. We have an eye tracking system that you can reserve and use for your classes or for your research. We have laptops, we have iPads, we have the laptops are preloaded with a bunch of different research software, statistical analysis, ePrime, etc. So if you need anything and we can help support you in your research, please let us know. If you are applying for external funding, if you would kindly consider adding CISLL as an affiliate center, we really appreciate any support and acknowledgement, because we use the indirects from your successful grants to put on programming like this and to be able to offer you resources. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mandy, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker for today.
So thank you, Allison. All right, so I am pleased to announce our first Winter Colloquium speaker. Dr. Gary Lupyan is here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is a professor of psychology and also the area chair for cognitive neuroscience. Dr. Lupyan directs a lab that I was reading the lab philosophy about question-driven as opposed to methods-driven research. And I think this is really exciting and sort of leads in nicely to the talk today, because driving your research based on questions that are worth investigating as opposed to a specific experimental paradigm leads to a breadth of really important sort of dovetailing questions. And that sort of breadth of research areas is reflected in the numerous different types of journals. These, among many others, that work from his lab can be found. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Gary, who will be talking to us today about the question of what are we learning from language.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to share this work with you, and we'll start big. Like other animals, humans learn a lot about the world from our direct experiences, from doing things, from seeing things, from experiencing things through our other senses. Unlike other animals, we also learn a lot from language. And a question we can ask, then what comes first, the concept, the mental category, the idea, or the word? We've got the word, dog. We have our mental concept, mental representation of dogs. We have dogs out in the world. What is the relationship between these things? On one view, still fairly widespread, this is a more traditional model of language. Our mind is filled with all kinds of concepts, some of which we might be born with, others that we learn from our direct experiences of the world. And as we learn language, we learn to map the words of that language to these internal representations. So word learning on this view is viewed as a kind of mapping problem. We see this idea kind of very clearly explicated in this paper by Peggy Lee and Lila Gleitman. Linguistic categories and structures are more or less straightforward mappings from a pre-existing conceptual space. Humans invent words that label their concepts. The word dog sort of points to this idea in your head. Here's another similar perspective from Anna Papafragu, who also worked with Lila Gleitman, kind of cementing this view of language acquisition as this mapping problem. And so the child has various concepts in their head, and these may not map onto the words in the language they happen to learn, but if you subscribe to this view, language itself isn't really doing much work in shaping the concepts that you have. That doesn't mean that all languages have words for all the same things. We know there's a lot of linguistic diversity. It's in fact very difficult to come up with any sort of lexical universals. If we kind of poll our intuitions, surely all languages will have a word that means eat or a word that means head, right? But you find that no, there are many ways of carving up the world, and English happens to have a very general word, eat and move, that maps onto all kinds of eating. Other languages have more specific words, depending on the kind of food you're eating, depending on, as I'll show you, what kinds of things you're moving. So it's totally fine, okay, a language that you're learning doesn't have a word for something, but on this view, it should have no consequences for your conceptual representations. Here's a different way of thinking about words and meanings, and more in line with the view that I've been advocating for in my work. So this is a quote from Jeff Ellman, who writes, "Words might be thought of in the same way that one thinks of other kinds of sensory stimuli. They act directly on mental states." So words on this view don't map onto meanings. They are cues to meaning. They're one way to construct and to activate meanings. And when you frame the question in this way, it leads to a different set of further questions that you can then test empirically. So if you think about words as cues, well, what kind of cues are words? What's the difference between conveying the idea of a dog by showing someone the picture of a dog versus having the word dog? How does language shape, quote-unquote, non-linguistic knowledge or abilities? And what and how are we learning from language itself? And so on this view, it's not the case that we're arguing that language is equivalent to thought. Rather, the idea is that human thinking, in virtually all cases, is heavily augmented by language. So lots of animals form categories, humans form categories, but what's different in the human case is that our categories are being augmented by our experience with language. So a few background kind of operational definitions, so we're all on the same page. So what I mean when I talk about categorization is it's treating perceptibly different items as, for some purpose, being equivalent, right? So you can all see and appreciate the differences between these dogs, but for the purposes of naming and for other purposes as well, you might want to treat them as all being members of the same group, the same category as all dogs. Here are different kinds of fruit. You can treat them as, at a more basic level, as oranges, apples, grapes, and so on, but you also can categorize them as members of the same category. That goes for these sort of perceptual categories like colors. You can tell the difference between these different shades of blue. You can also think of them as all being blues. And formal categories like triangles and even numbers. For speakers of any particular language, mastering a language often comes with this strong intuition that the reason that we call certain things by the same name is that they are inherently similar. Once you start looking at different vocabulary systems, different language systems, you realize that, well, they are similar, but there are many ways of drawing out this similarity. Okay? And so to take something like the category open, we can open an envelope, we can open a drawer, we can open eyes, open a box. In English, linguistic meaning open subsumes all of these kinds of situations. And we might have the intuition that, well, yeah, because they're all instances of opening. All it takes is for some cross-linguistic comparison to be convinced that this is not the only way of constructing this kind of category. So this is from work of Bowerman and Soonja Choi, comparing, in this case, Korean and English categories of open, showing that these categories cross-cut one another. Korean does not have a word that would map on to the English meaning of open. Instead, there are these more specific terms that pick out different senses of opening. And as English speakers, you can appreciate that, okay, yeah, I can see what they might have in common, but it would not necessarily occur to you that they would be subsumed by the same label the way they are in another language. Here's another example from carrying. So I mentioned English has a lot of these, actually, very general terms. Simple enough, you can think about carrying different kinds of things, but it seems totally natural to conceive of carrying as this more abstract verb. And so one might be surprised that in many languages, there is no direct translation to such a thing. So there's Navajo, so in English, right, carrying any object supported by any part of the body. Those are all acts of carrying. In other languages, the categories picked out by the translation equivalents are different. Right? And so if for nothing else than for the purposes of speaking the language, a Navajo speaker, CISLL speaker has to master these categories. It's not that English speakers can't conceive of them, they just might seem a little counterintuitive. The question we can ask is, do these differences matter? They are descriptively interesting, but do they matter for communication? Do they matter for cognition? And historically, people have been skeptical about these things. Sure, it helps to have a word for something, but it seems like how hard can it be to just paraphrase a meaning? For example, Lila Gleitman's view, when children learn the word, they already have the underlying category. I heard Lila say once, how can you learn the word for a concept you don't already have? Right? So it's a particular way of thinking about this problem. And so here are some kind of classic quotes from, again, Lila Gleitman. All languages have the formal and expressive power to communicate the ideas, beliefs, and desires of their users. From Bloom and Kyle, from Steve Pinker. And so in my work, I've been, over the last couple of decades, challenging these kinds of views and trying to think a bit differently about these questions. Categories are constructed, not simply extracted. And this is a quote from Worf. Taking this constructivist view, right, of knowledge, the categories aren't just there in the world, in the environment, we have to construct them. And for Worf, this constructive process, which in psychology we now take for granted, so we grant this view of categories having to be constructed. And the question becomes, which at the time Worf was writing was still a fairly radical idea. For Worf, this constructive process was largely linguistic. And that's the empirical question, right? How much work is language itself doing in the process of constructing categories? So the first study I'll show you focuses on these kinds of lexical differences and their consequences for communication, and then all the subsequent studies focus more on kind of progressively lower level cognitive, in one case perceptual processing. So one interesting lexical difference between languages is in superordinate categories. If you look at items on the left, aspirin, marijuana, cocaine, if you ask English speakers, what would you call all these things, right? Mice, cockroaches, raccoons, these are all drugs, these are all pests. For the ones on the right, if you ask English speakers, you get a much wider diversity of responses. So what salt, vinegar, pepper, right? Seasonings, but vinegar isn't really a seasoning, right? River, mountains, plateaus, people might say natural objects, but that seems overly broad, right? But in other languages, in this case Chinese, there is a conventional superordinate term that encompasses these items. Again, the question we wanted to ask, this is with a former postdoc in my lab, Lilia Rissman, do these kinds of differences matter for communication? These are all familiar items, even if you don't have a conventional term for it, to say what all these things have in common, but nevertheless, does having versus not having a conventional term matter? And so we had participants do a director-matcher task. Here's how it worked. One person saw a grid of words, and this was done with both English speakers and Mandarin Chinese speakers. And so they see a grid of words, 3 of them are highlighted, and they have to provide some linguistic cue that would allow someone else to click on the same words in their grid. Those words and only those words. So on the left, that's the director, on the right is the matcher. And as a matcher, you can commit 2 kinds of errors, right? You can fail to click on a word that you should click on, right? Or you can click on too many things. Both English and Chinese speakers had categories that had conventional subordinates in their language and that had conventional subordinates in the other language. So you can see how well people do for the categories that are easy for them to name versus categories that are pretty familiar but harder to name. And so here's the basic result. We have this crossover interaction where people are more accurate for categories that are easier for them to name in their native language. And we control for things like familiarity with the underlying items, and you still have this effect. So it's more difficult to align on a category when it's easy to paraphrase it, but not having at your disposal the conventional term nevertheless makes a difference. So one example where these differences in whether something has a name or not is having an obvious impact on communication. what about cognition? So it's one thing to find, like, yeah, not having a word for something makes it harder to talk about the thing. What about for cognition? So here's one perspective that I am very much in agreement with from Steve Levinson, who frames this issue of learning, in this case, a vocabulary, as vocabulary is a guide to which things should be chunked together. So he says we don't have to think about 100 as 10 tens. So yes, it's true, right, that formally 100 is just 10 tens, but it feels like having that word, 100, kind of makes it into a better unit, right? It chunks it in a way that you might not otherwise. And so he goes on to argue that composing complex concepts gives enormous power to our mental computation. Most of these complex concepts are inherited from the language we happen to speak. That's a more controversial take. We can test this. Do easier to name things really make for better cognitive chunks? Here, right, you might think, well, this is not about communication now. Would it still help? Would it still matter if you have a conventional word for something? In this next study, we used colors as stimuli, and some colors, the ones on the top, are, at least for English speakers, easy to name. If you ask people in a free naming task to just name these colors, even in a totally open-ended task, that for these colors, 85–90% of people, orange, red, blue, brown. And for these bottom ones, I'll show you the modal color names. So these are the most frequently chosen ones, but they were only mentioned by like 6 to 10% of the participants. Okay, mustard, lavender, gray. This one is actually kind of a dark, weird green, but gray ends up being the modal color. What we then did is do a category learning task. Here's what a trial would look like. There's a little color wheel in the middle, and you have to drag it over to the left or right, depending on what category you think it belongs in. In the beginning, you're just guessing, but you're getting feedback, correct, incorrect, depending on whether you responded correctly. And then over the course of 10, 15 minutes, you start learning, and you get fairly good at the end. Made something belong to one category or another was very, very simple, especially when you see all the stimuli presented simultaneously. So in both cases, here these color wheels are composed of more nameable colors, less nameable colors. Having a red slice means you're in category A. Having a brown slice means you're in category B. And in this case, having this sort of lavender slice means you're in A, and having this brownish, whatever, color slice means you're in category B. So same, very simple rule. It's just being instantiated with harder to name or easier to name colors. And it makes a big difference. We control for perceptual discriminability. All of these colors are, that's not really an issue here, are very easy to tell apart. We can also replicate it in a purely within subject version. So you might think that, okay, once a person realizes what the logic of the categories is, it would be really easy to apply it to the other categories. So in this case, everyone has to learn the 4 categories. 2 of them are harder to name, 2 of them are easier to name. And even so, we replicate this very large effect. We've also done this with children, 6-year-old children. Interestingly, that's about as young as you can test for this kind of task. And there's a reason why there isn't a huge literature on rule learning in kids, because kids find this very, very difficult. They do all kinds of seemingly much more complicated things, right? 3-year-olds are doing very sophisticated things, but when it comes to like learning these kinds of abstract rules, you can't really start much younger than 6, because most of them just like don't know what you want them to do. But kids show this nameability effect as well, and it's correlated with their knowledge of color names. Now, it's not just a color thing. We can replicate this with these sorts of tangram shapes that allow us much more perceptual control. So here are these shapes made up of triangles. They're put into arrangements that are relatively nameable, like duck, camel, cat. And you can just flip it upside down, maintaining all the low-level visual similarity now in the less nameable configuration. Then we repeat the same type of experiment. You have to learn whether something belongs to category A or B, and you get the same thing. There is really something about nameability that makes it easier to construct these kinds of categories. One way to think about it is that when it's more nameable, it's easier to kind of pose and test the hypothesis like, oh, is it about the red thing? Is that what it is? Right? Then is it about this, whatever, this color, lavenderish color thing? So does it matter if something is named? Yes. we can keep going. So is the work of language done once you've learned the label, or does it augment kind of ongoing processing as it unfolds? Might it even affect our ability to perceive certain things? So let's get back to colors. Colors in the world are not categorical. They're continuous spaces, but when we name, we draw boundaries, we draw a distinction, right, where a bunch of things that we might call green kind of relatively suddenly transition to things that we call blue. So we can think of this as, we have this more continuous space and we're imposing a more categorical structure on it. And so the basic idea is that when you impose this more categorical structure, the things that straddle the boundary, so right, if this is the boundary between greens and blues, they should become more discriminable, so easier to perceive. The things that are, all typical blues and typical greens might become harder to tell apart. But even actually, it's a bit counterintuitive. In the middle of the category, you could see that things become more spaced out. So processing color more categorically leads to the prediction that people should have an easier time actually telling kind of a fairly typical blue from a slightly less typical blue. And so we wanted to test this using a fairly straightforward color discrimination task. There are 4 circles here, and 3 of them are the same, and 1 is slightly different. And the task is just respond which one is different. The difference could straddle the category boundaries. And the manipulation here is whether prior to the appearance of these 4 circles, you hear the category name. So on some trials, participants hear the word green. Now, you don't need the color name to do the task, right? Because it's just which one is different. Doesn't matter what color it is, doesn't matter whether one is green, the other is blue. Which one is different? But the idea is that hearing green will induce you to represent colors in a more categorical way, and so should make certain kinds of distinctions easier and others perhaps harder. And that's what we're seeing here. So red line shows the trials. This is all within subjects. Red line shows the trials in which people aren't hearing any color names. Here is when they hear green, blue, red, yellow. And you could see that at the boundary, so between categories, you get this big boost. You also get a boost in the middle of the category, and you get a slight decline in accuracy around the prototype. One of the control conditions looks at what happens if you communicate seemingly the same category in a nonverbal way. So instead of hearing the word green, you actually see a preview of the exact color that's different from the others. So instead of hearing the word green, you actually see a little color swatch that's the same shade of green as the one that's different. And that has absolutely no effect. We know that there are large differences in color nameability across languages. This is often presented as, oh, well, some languages have 2 words, light blue, dark blue. Other languages have the same word for green and blue. The differences are more radical than that. So here's a comparison of English and Lao. The size of the circle corresponds to nameability. How much agreement is there among speakers on what to call the color? And so what you see, and this is fairly typical, is that the differences are primarily not in the size of the categories, not in what counts as green or what counts as blue, but that different languages have different parts of the color space as being nameable. In the case of colors, English provides speakers with a lot of resources. In the case of smell, English compared to many languages does not. We don't have very many words for smell that people agree on. And so a consequence of the kind of study that I just showed you is that, if you imagine trying to do this study with a speaker of Laotian, how would you cue the same category, the same kind of greenness in a person who doesn't have the label green? Well, you can't really, right? It's that you come into the experiment already kind of pre-programmed with certain labels that you learned as just part of learning the language. And now we can activate those conceptual categories using the label in a way that's much more difficult, perhaps in some cases even impossible, if you couldn't use that label in the moment. And this is just the reanalysis of some previous data that's been collected in the paper, Majid et al., looking at correlations of nameability across languages. And you can see that they're all positive, so it's not the case that there's no consistency in which colors are more nameable, but these correlations aren't very high. So the highest it gets is about 0.4, 0.5, showing that there's substantial differences across languages in which colors are nameable. Continuing this theme of actually using language, so not just the difference between learning one label versus learning a different label, but actually using the label in the moment, we were interested in this question of, like, what is it that makes labels different from conveying information compared to, for example, seeing, the color green itself. And one idea is that what's different about language is that language has this kind of categorical character, right? I'd say language deals in categories, right? Where the units of language are these categories, right? If you think about the units of perception, they're much more about particulars. So it's not straightforward to convey the idea of greenness, right, perceptually, because any instance of greenness is a particular kind of green, right? And it's also generally like it's also an object, right, that has that color. Same thing with things like dogs, right? So the category of dogs versus the specific dog. If you take, for example, the difference between conveying the idea of dogness using the word dog compared to a dog bark, which people very easily, including young children, recognize that, yes, that's a dog. The relationship between dog barks and dogs, right, is somewhat categorical, right? So dog barks are categorically different from, like, meows, okay? But they also encode more specific information. So if you hear a dog bark, you don't just know it's a dog, you know something about the kind of dog that it is. Like, is it a big dog or a small dog? And actually, the more you know about dogs, the more specific, the more information you can glean from the bark. So the form, one way to think about it, of nonverbal cues like a dog bark or a picture is more specific. It's motivated. There's a motivated relationship between the form of the bark and the kind of dog that it is. When it comes to words, the relationship is somewhat different. So based on the form of the word, you can tell a lot about the speaker. So we can tell, for example, and people are very good at telling how old someone is from just a snippet of their speech. You can tell, to some extent, where they're from based on their pronunciation, right? So there's a motivated relationship between speakers and word forms. But when it comes to the relationship between word forms and their reference, it's much more unmotivated, right? I talked to folks at dinner yesterday about iconicity, and we've done a bunch of work on the resemblance between word forms and meanings. And indeed, we do this quite naturally. If you notice how people talk to kids, for example, you kind of unconsciously will lower your pitch when you say dog if you're talking about a bigger dog, and raise your pitch if you're talking about a smaller dog. So we're sensitive to these sort of motivated relationships. But that said, language largely kind of abstracts away from them. And so this leads to an interesting prediction, which is that if you take a task like this, I'll go over in a moment, we should be able to see what some of the consequences are for cueing information in this verbal versus nonverbal way. The task here is a simple picture recognition task. You hear some cue, you then see a picture, and you just have to respond yes or no whether the cue and the picture matched. All that matters is matching at the level of category. So you might hear the word guitar. If you see a guitar, yes. If you see something else, no. It's as simple as that. How do you convey the idea of a guitar without using the word guitar? Well, you might play a guitar sound. Of course, that guitar sound can't just refer to any guitar. Okay, for example, it has to be like, is it an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar? Like, you have to choose. And so you are conveying necessarily more specific information. You could hear the word guitar, or you could hear a guitar sound. You could hear a classical guitar sound, and you might then see a classical guitar or an electric guitar. You hear different kind of dog barks, different sort of motorcycle engine sounds. All that matters is the category. Is it a motorcycle? Is it a dog? Is it a guitar? Even though words are conveying, in a way, less information, less specific information, when the task is just to categorize, words will be the most effective cues. That's the prediction, because it's activating, the word is activating just the information that you need to tell members from non-members. So the word guitar is what it's specializing in, is activating a mental representation that maximally distinguishes guitars and non-guitars in a way that's hard to replicate without actually using the word. I'll show you some data. So these are reaction times. The task is very easy, so accuracy is going to be at close to 100%. So this is how long it takes people to correctly recognize an acoustic guitar, for example, after hearing an electric guitar sound. So the sound doesn't match the category at this finer level. And if they match, people are faster. So if you hear an electric guitar sound, you're faster to recognize an electric guitar compared to an acoustic guitar. So what about just the word guitar? That's faster still. So it's conveying less information, but just the right kind of information. Our vocabulary provides us with these ready-made cognitive chunks that we can deploy in communicative, individual problem solving, like having to learn these rule-based categories. If I had to kind of give the one-sentence summary of a lot of the work that we've done in this vein, it would be summarized as language enhances categorization. It kind of provides a categorical overlay over the specificities and the details that given to us by our perceptual system. One consequence of enhanced categorization, and this is more recent work now, is greater conceptual alignment. And the intuition for this is straightforward. So in activating a mental representation that is more categorical, what that actually means is activating features that are typical of the category and maximally distinguishing, as I mentioned, between things. Dogs are often contrasted with cats. So what are things that are true of dogs and not true of cats? Okay, so providing this sort of contrastive representation. And those kinds of representations, almost by necessity, tend to be more aligned, more similar. So here's an example. If you look at, for example, coffee pots that are rated by people as being more typical. Okay? So you show people coffee pot, how typical is this coffee pot of coffee pots in general? So here are 3 coffee pots that people rate as being fairly typical. And here are 3 that people rate as being more atypical. And notice, right, these are more different from one another. So as you become more typical, you tend to converge. And the prediction, therefore, is that under the influence of language, or more enhanced influence of language, people's mental representations should converge to be more similar to other people's. And so here's the task we used to test this hypothesis. We generated these kinds of shapes that by design were easy to distinguish. These are obviously different, but kind of hard to name. And so we then generate a kind of family resemblance structure. So A and B are these prototypical shapes. And then we perturb them a bit to generate kind of a family of shapes that all resemble one another and are all kind of easy to distinguish from one another, but are also novel and hard to name. Now, the main task is just sort the shapes. So you see all these shapes on a screen, and you have to arrange them into categories in whatever way makes sense to you. There are 3 conditions. The baseline condition, that's the whole experiment. You see these shapes, arrange them in however way makes sense to you. In a no-label condition, participants are pre-exposed to the shapes in the way that I'll show you in a moment. And in a label condition, they also hear their names, just nonsense words. So let me walk you through it. So this is 2 non-baseline conditions. Before sorting, here's what participants do. They see one shape, then they see 2 shapes. One of those is exactly the same as the top one, and they just have to say which matches. Now, importantly, the other one is from a different category. So it's providing people with practice distinguishing these shapes into 2 categories, either with labels or without labels. So without labels, it would just work like that. And with labels, the top shape, participants, when it's shown, participants hear a gek or a taup. Now, this task itself is trivially easy. People don't have to learn to do this. They're at 100% throughout, but it just gives people pre-exposure to the shapes. And we're going to look at 3 things. We're going to look at how categorical are the sorts, so how clumpy are they? How many clusters did they form? And how similar are people's sorts in these 3 conditions? We're going to measure categoricality as the difference between, so how far apart the items that we said belong to the same category are in the sorts compared to items that we said belong to different categories. Number of clusters is just how many clusters. And alignment is just the correlation between distances, all the pairwise distances of these items. even without being pre-exposed to the shapes, participants group shapes in the same category closer to one another than shapes in different categories. So that's by design. It shows that people are sensitive to this perceptual similarities. Being pre-exposed to those shapes in this categorical context, but without the labels, doesn't really make any difference. And being pre-exposed to the shapes with labels makes people slightly but significantly more categorical. Okay, so they tend to put shapes within the category closer together and shapes in different categories farther apart. This is another way of plotting the same data. So labels are promoting more categorical sorts. Labels are also making it more likely that participants form only two clusters. And the thing that we were most excited about is this alignment metric. So however many clusters people form, however categorical they are, their sorts are more similar. So sorts of people in the label condition are more similar to one another than sorts of people in these other two conditions, and these two don't differ. Okay, so labels promote more aligned sorts. There's a strong relationship between categoricality of the sort and the alignment, and so it shows that what's happening is that labels induce greater categoricality, which has the effect of more alignment. What else can language do? So in a very general sense, language is a teacher. Right? To what extent does our conceptual knowledge come from language itself? And there are a few ways of thinking about this question, right? One is fairly self-evident. Language contains a lot of propositional information. That's what a lot of formal schooling is, right? Just teaching facts. And a lot of these are conveyed through language. So think about history, right? It would be very hard to learn any kind of history through direct personal experience, right? Like you can't experience the past. I guess you can watch, reenactments of something, but that's kind of like, what does that mean? It's very hard to contextualize. So there's a whole lot of information that you would just simply not know in the absence of language because you have no access to it except through language, right? And so that's like fairly self-evident. There's other kinds of information, right, that language provides that's more inferential. So if you know something about what makes something a marsupial, and you learn through language that Tasmanian devils are marsupials, you can extend what you know about marsupials to Tasmanian devils. All right, so kind of a shortcut. You don't have to personally inspect Tasmanian devils to see if they share various biological features with other marsupials. And then there's also information that you could learn through direct experience, but it's expensive. And so language can be a less costly guide to what kind of mushrooms are poisonous. There is a more surprising and at this point like more astonishing way of thinking about the kind of information embedded in language and what it might be teaching us. Could it be that embedded within the structure of language itself is a far richer repository of conceptual knowledge than we thought? Back in 2018, Doug Hofstadter published this article in The Atlantic about the shallowness of Google Translate, where he was arguing that no matter how grammatically impressive machine translation is, it's pretty obvious that it has no underlying understanding. For example, it's called the Winograd sentence. So you have a trombone didn't fit in a suitcase because it was too small. We as human language users understand that it refers to the suitcase, not the trombone. We are using our world knowledge to help us parse the sentence. It's not ambiguous to us. There is the Spanish translation of that sentence, and in Spanish it's not grammatically ambiguous, and so you can sort of unmask whether it is getting it right or not, and it's not. What is too small in this case is the trombone. And so back then, and Doug has since changed his mind for reasons I'll mention in a moment, as of 2018 the take was, well, if it's meaningful, it's because it's meaningful to us, right? We are making sense out of it. The models, there's no sense in the models. Well, fast forward a few years, and these kinds of sentences no longer pose a challenge. So this is ChatGPT, right? No problem. Now, in more rigorous testing, there's still a difference between GPT-4's ability to parse Winograd sentences and human ability, but it's rapidly shrinking. And when it comes to other things that have more contextual support, there's no difference anymore. So in this, for example, recent work, the hardest cases to parse, where you really have to bring in your world knowledge, you can't rely on statistics at all to resolve. Paul tried to call George, but mask, so there's a masked word, wasn't successful or available, depending on whether it continues successful, right? This should be Paul, right? If it's available, then George, right? Wasn't available. The models are able to parse these, trained only on language. And so one interpretation is that learning only from language, which is not the case for any actual person. No person learns only from language. But here you have neural networks whose only input is language, and it seems that it's enough to learn some semblance of underlying world models, right, that until recently we just didn't think was not just doable by people, but in principle possible. And this connects in interesting ways to work that's been happening over the last 5 or so years with looking at visual knowledge among people who are born blind. Because again, the intuition is that, well, of course, people who are blind have other senses, they can learn all kinds of things, but surely the visual world, we learn it from our direct experiences, so how much can blind people know about vision? Well, and it turns out the answer is quite a lot, right? And so this is one of papers from Marina Bedny's lab, where congenitally blind participants were asked to judge the semantic similarity of different words, picking out specific aspects of the visual world, right? So twinkle, flash, flare. Here are the multiple dimensional scaling solutions for blind and sighted people, and they look pretty similar. In fact, they are extremely, extremely similar. So despite, right, not having any direct experience with things like sparkling and flashing and twinkling, blind people's semantic judgments are, in this case, indistinguishable from those of sighted people. It's not just word meanings that are strikingly similar. It's really world meanings. So this is Tommy Edison, who was born blind, and kind of a ask me anything.
Is, do I know what transparent, translucent, or even reflective things are? Do I understand how they work and what they do? We're going to break it down into 3 parts. I'm going to tell you what I know about each one of these things and what might have those properties, and then Ben is going to name up a bunch of things as well. And we'll see what I know about the things that he names, and maybe I'll learn something too. So what I know about transparency is that light can pass through it, you can see through it. People talk about, my presidency is going to be very transparent. You're going to be able to, that means you'll be able to see right through it and know exactly what's going on. I really don't know what it means to be able to see right through something. In other words, when you look at something, do you see the window and the thing, or do you not see the window, right? So if you're looking out of a car window at another car, do you see the car window as well as the other car, or just the other car? See, that's the kind of thing I don't know. I think I can only think of a couple of things that are really transparent, like a window or a piece of glass, right? But a mirror wouldn't be transparent because that's, you're not seeing through that. Like a glass that you might drink out of is transparent. You can see right through that. Saran wrap, like plastic wrap, that kind of stuff that you wrap food with, that I would think you could see through that. A beer bottle, a bottle of whiskey, a bottle of scotch, like through a glass shelf in the refrigerator. I imagine you'd be able to see right through that. And water too. You can look through water if it's clean water and see right to the bottom. I suppose there are some plastics that are transparent too, like something that food might come in, you might be able to look right through. I would imagine like glass beads, that people wear for jewelry and stuff, you could look through those.
So where'd you learn about a lot of these things?
I feel like I learned a lot of this in school, like in science class and stuff. But then from everyday life too, from people being in cars and, would you look at what that person's doing in that other car. Like, for example, the water. How many times have I been to the beach and people say, look, it's beautiful, you can see right to the bottom, this clear blue water.
So we shouldn't expect people to have much ability to reflect on how blind people actually learn this information. But what's striking is these are coherent semantic models, right? It's not the case of, I heard this being described as visual world, so I'm just going to repeat it. It's not like that. Large language models, whose only experience is language, right? We can actually see that in this case, this is an old study now, some work we published in response to one of Marina Bedny's students' papers showing that this kind of information that both sighted and congenitally blind people show with regard to visual knowledge of animals, visual knowledge of different adjectives, in the word co-occurrence patterns, right? So that information is embedded in the structure of language itself. So you can learn, right, that the sky is blue and that blue is more similar, right, to purple than it is to yellow, not because anyone ever said it. You can remove all sentences that actually state those facts, and that information is still as embedded in language as before. This is, of course, Helen Keller, and I didn't know about this article that she published back in 1929. I'm blind, yet I see. I'm deaf, yet I hear. Kind of speaking, in this case, it's more about kind of how much information that she's able to get from touch. And I think we can reflect now, almost 100 years later, right, on what we're learning about just how much information is embedded in language itself, right? So here we have models that have no senses, right? Now there's the multimodal models. Turns out it doesn't make them that much better, right? But there's all the semantic information embedded in the structure of language itself. Okay, and so here's the summary slide putting it all together. The function of language, we've argued, is not merely to communicate already present ideas. Language is not just a mapping, it's a teacher. Having a word for something really matters. Now, some of those things we would learn with or without language. But many others we would not learn, or many people would not learn, were it not for the guidance of language. Learning from language is not quite the same as learning from the world, largely because language has this categorical and compositional character that, for example, sensory information does not to the same extent. And large language models, we're really living in an interesting time. They are, from a cognitive science perspective, they're this astonishing existence proof, right, of just how much is, in principle, learnable from language itself. It doesn't mean that that's what people do, but it shows that that information is in language because it can be recovered with statistical principles. Anything you can show a person, you ask them, okay, can you describe it for me? They're not going to be at a loss for words. They're going to say something. And so these shapes, we designed them to be hard to name. It doesn't mean that people can't name them or that it's difficult to come up with some contrastive way of labeling them. And there's no doubt that people do that in these studies. It's just that having those labels, even if they're these nonsense labels, goes beyond that. It does more than that. So people are often, with these kinds of harder to name stimuli, they're not necessarily even consistent within themselves. And that goes for colors as well. So in principle, if someone has a perfectly reliable color term for that lavender type color, that should be just as good as a label like red. It's just, in general, at the population level, that's less likely. And so I don't want to give the impression that it's impossible, right, to do these tasks in the absence of labels. People obviously do them. But on the whole, it's harder, and there's also more variability. So one study that we ran a while back was a visual search task that involved searching for these sort of rotated, if you imagine kind of a 2 in like a digital font, like on an alarm clock, so a 2 and a 5, so they're just mirror images of each other, just rotated 90 degrees. And that task, find a 2 among 5s, is relatively difficult. If you just tell people, oh yeah, these are rotated numbers, it becomes much easier. Now, the people who are not told that, some of them figure it out on their own. And they just look just like the ones who were told that these are rotated numbers. So you could, in that case, it's not a trial-by-trial kind of queuing, but just like ascribing meaning to these novel shapes. If you're doing it on your own, that's just as good. And in that case, people are consistent. Yeah. These are all sort of metaphors, right? So it's that they lead people to ask different types of questions. And on the kind of mapping approach, you assume that the categories are already there. There are certainly cases where that's true. So if you're an adult learning a second language, that very much is kind of like, okay, I know I have this meaning, I have this category, I know what it's called in my L1, like what is it in L2? And that can, of course, get in the way because often there isn't a perfect translation, and that's how you end up with, kind of, you get stuck because you don't, the familiar category is very entrenched. But as a child learning their first language, it's not that the child is a blank slate, but so many of the categories in any language are these sort of historical constructions. They weren't always what they are now, even within a language. They shift across time. And they're just one of many ways of imposing categories on the world. And so we can think of on this idea of cueing, right, that the language is providing you with these cues of like, okay, you're noticing the same label is being used across these situations. And that's a kind of, so Sandy Waxman has called this invitation to categories. It's kind of a guide for the child that, okay, what do all these things have in common? Leading the child to construct a category that they might not otherwise construct, right? And so, whereas the mapping way of thinking about it presupposes that, okay, you've got this, and then language learning is just this mapping process. Esperanto is the most successful invented language, and of course, one reason it's been so successful is that it didn't try to create kind of a language from first principles. None of those attempts have been very successful, but instead kind of used existing languages and combined them together in ways that lots of speakers, particularly in Europe, already had some, they would have spoken one of the constituent languages as their native language. That combined with the social aspect, right? There are Esperanto conventions and kind of, it's this identity for people, and that's why it's been relatively successful. In practice, of course, languages are these political entities, and so, right now English is the kind of de facto global language. That wasn't, of course, always the case, and so for a lot of people, right, it's sort of like it makes a lot more sense to learn English than than to learn some other language, even though in an ideal world it would be great to have this. So it's sort of a political question more than anything. I mean, what's also interesting is that as English has become a global language, it's not the case that English as spoken in different parts of the world has converged, right? And if anything, it's the opposite. There's more divergence, for example, between Australian English, American English, Indian English, right? And that's because English has these, apart from, straightforward kind of communication functions, it has these social functions of, helping you to identify with a group. I think for there to be a kind of universal world language, we would have to have a very different, world. Yeah. Fodor, maybe just in his wilder days, did argue for, because his brief foray into some experimental work showed him, right, that concepts don't decompose in a way that they should, and so he went to this, everything is, innate view. But that was not a very popular idea. So the one trouble with it is just empirical, that no one's been able to provide some list of primitives that helps explain. So the kind of semantic primitives that, and this is kind of leads to this interesting counterintuitive prediction and evidence, which is the best candidates for semantic primitives are these fairly abstract things like agent, patient, right? And so all languages have ways of conveying these ideas through grammar. Now, when it comes to kind of content words, there are really no primitives. Now, within certain domains, color, there's lots of work on kinship. It's not anything goes. So there are a few different ways of organizing kinship systems, but for example, age and gender tend to play a large role. And then, the differences between languages are more about like, how do you combine these dimensions? What's interesting there, so I want to say two things. What's interesting there is that, and Anna Verzbicka has made this point in, I think this book, Imprisoned in English, kind of viewing things through an English lens, which is that when an English, say, linguist or philosopher maybe as well, is faced with these differences, they might say, okay, we have this word brother, and in this other language, they distinguish between older brother and younger brother. Okay, so there's no just word for brother, there's a word for younger brother and older brother. And so okay, the chunk here is brother, and then they kind of add this further distinction, which we, of course, can appreciate, but we don't, is optional for us. The irony is that if one were to come from the other direction, one would be led to the conclusion that, like, okay, well, the obvious unit here is, younger brother, right? That's the unit. Older brother, and these English speakers are, for some reason, conflating this basic distinction into this vague term. So we have these strong intuitions that the categories, the basic categories, just happen to map onto the words that we all speak. And that's, you can see that, right? The convention of spelling out concepts, right, in small caps that happen to correspond to single English words. Barbara Malt has made this point also that, like, isn't that suspicious that, like, our non-linguistic concepts just happen to correspond to these basic English words? Never mind that, like, those words don't exist in other languages. So that's one kind of weird thing. If we come with these primitive concepts, why is there as much cross-linguistic lexical diversity as there is? And then the other thing is that the things that are supposed to be universal, one can find them descriptively, but they are surprisingly not cognitively accessible. So for example, if you give people a task like, here are a bunch of objects, sort them, and the objects are cars and trucks, okay? It becomes obvious, like, yeah, okay, cars, trucks. No one thinks that's innate, okay? So this is obviously a learned category that people are deploying for this task. Now you do the same task with a supposedly innate category like agent and patient, and many people are totally stumped. They're not putting, in this kind of non-linguistic context, they're not putting all the members of, like, agency together. And one would think that if this is this innate kind of already there category, it should be more accessible than it actually is empirically. And so that's sort of unexpected on the view. But I mean, it's an empirical question. If one is able to provide a kind of evidence that, yeah, there are these primitive kind of semantic chunks that are just being recombined in different ways. I have 2 kids of my own, and it's been super interesting kind of watching language development in person. We tend to have a double standard when it comes to, for example, evaluating. In my lab, we've been doing a lot of work with these large language models and kind of engaged in that discourse, right, where these models will sometimes make these catastrophic errors that lead us to think, like, okay, anything that can make an error like that can't have any coherent underlying model, can't have any understanding. And of course, kids, when you really pay attention, kids make all kinds of catastrophic errors, right? Like, what is Anita's name, right? Like, it's like, okay, someone who asks that question, they clearly don't understand how naming works. But, like, no, they kind of do. It's just they also, so there's much less consistency than we often think. And so kids will use a word, and we give them credit. We kind of view it as, like, developmentally interesting. We don't see it as a catastrophic error. They'll use a word in often very inconsistent ways, right? And it just shows, right, that there is this actually long process of maturation. The way we assess kids' language knowledge is really, I think, very coarse, right? And so, for example, like PPVT, picture vocabulary, right? I understand how it got to be this way, but from, like, a scientific perspective, it's weird, right? So, there are 4 pictures. You ask, okay, point to the dog. The kid points to the dog. Right? That's the first item, I think, on the test. And the dog is the only animal of the 4 choices, right? So to get that right, you don't need to know much more than a dog is an animal. And you have no idea what a child thinks a dog is from their getting that question right. Same thing with, like, age of acquisition norms, all these things, right? We know, like, kids at this age are this likely to know this word, but what exactly do they know, right? Now we have much less to say, right? And so I think it's a much more protracted process than we often realize, where kids will use a word correctly in one context, but then they don't. It's not that they just don't use it totally incorrectly in another context. They just don't say anything in the other context, right? And we don't take that as evidence of often of limited knowledge. And so just the other day, I've mentioned it earlier, my 3.5-year-old, he's been playing with magnetiles for, like, weeks, kind of obsessively. And he noticed after weeks and weeks of playing with magnetiles that, like, they stick to the fridge. And he was just like, I didn't know they were magnets. Okay, and his older 6.5-year-old brother was like, Finn, they are literally called magnetiles, right? But like to him, right, magnets are the things that make things stick to the fridge, right? And here's like magnetiles, they're sticking to each other, so they're not, right? So all of this, like, my point is, it doesn't come for free. This generalization takes, an abstraction takes work. One corollary of this idea of languages dealing in categories is the categories are contrastive. And so you learn that something is green, right? That is implicitly telling you that it's not yellow and not red, provided that you've already formed some kind of semantic category of colors. And interestingly, this tweak, so that was the breakthrough of word2vec, where it's learning to predict the next word, the surrounding words, and it was able to learn these word embeddings, these, how similar different words are to one another, much, much more effectively if it used not only the direct positive evidence of, okay, these words, I made a prediction, it's correct, or it's incorrect, I'll adjust my error, but this word means it's not these words. And it was doing it in a very, very dumb way. It was just random words, frequency weight. People are doing it, I say, they're going through the same process in a much smarter way, right, where cat means not dog, but there are many other things that are not cats that are not really relevant to any context, right? Green means not yellow, but it doesn't mean not smooth, right? And so there is this kind of these implicit contrasts that are constantly being made when we're learning words and when we're actively using language. So this idea of contrast is everywhere.